It is great to be here at St. John in Little Canada. It's been a number of years since I was in this church for a funeral, and I really commend the folks who are putting on the live stream Mass with music and the Facebook Live. We've been doing that at Our Lady of Lourdes, where I'm pastor in Minneapolis, since late March, and it's not easy. There's a lot of moving parts, and to do a live stream Mass well with music and a lector and all of this is really commendable. So thank you to all who are making this happen. Father Dan Griffith is my name, and I'll get to a brief introduction of who I am in a minute. I want to thank Ryan, who's been my go-to person setting this up, Father Tom Balliff for his invitation, and all those that we've been working with setting this up. Now, when I was on sabbatical in South Texas and they reached out, I assumed, right, before the pandemic hit, that this would be, a preaching weekend. But alas, right, we're all in this together. Good news, though, you might have heard that the governor and the bishops of Minnesota and other church leaders were able to work out a compromise, so we all won't be celebrating Mass in defiance. I do think that the bishops had good cause. So just a word about that later. Father Dan Griffith, 18 years ordained on Monday, a priest of this archdiocese. I'm a native Wisconsinite. Don't hold that against me, please. And I was ordained in 2002, 3 years in Lakeville, and then 6 very happy years as pastor of St. Peter in North St. Paul, and had the opportunity to build the church there. And really wonderful group of people. I was there in December preaching on restorative justice. Now, I cut it a little close because there's a favorite meat market that I had to quick go there and get smoked salmon, which is the best in the Twin Cities. And so I was cutting it just a little close, but I was able to get a couple of wonderful things for the holiday. The other things that I do in the diocese is I am on the law faculty of St. Thomas School of Law. I've been there since 2011, and I was newly appointed as liaison for restorative justice and healing by Archbishop Hebden. I began that work in July, and one of the main dimensions of that ministry is going out to the parishes and preaching about restorative justice. One quick story about the East Side or the East Metro. So what I love about this part of the Twin Cities is people tell you what's on their mind, right? There isn't a lot of passive aggressiveness or anything like that. They tell you what they're thinking. So when I first started at St. Peter, there was a woman, she's probably in her 60s or 70s, had a bit of a kind of a gravelly voice, and she had heard that I wasn't a Minnesota Viking fan, but she didn't quite know why. She had just heard, well, Father's not a Viking fan. So she came up to me at the front steps and she said, "Father, why aren't you a Viking fan?" And I said, I was born 30 minutes from Green Bay, and it's in the blood. And she said, "You need a blood transfusion." True story. So I love being here where people tell you what's on their mind. Today we celebrate the Feast of the Ascension, and Scripture and tradition speak often and equate God's presence with the heavens, with mountains, with places of exaltation and height. And we certainly know the Transfiguration occurred likely on Mount Tabor. We know even Jesus was crucified in Calvary up on one of the higher places in Jerusalem. We know that Moses is given, right, the relationship with God and the Ten Commandments, and his relationship is cemented on Mount Sinai. And also we understand that our movement of faith and our spiritual life is often described as an ascent, a movement upward, right? Our hearts are moved upward into our life with God. When we experience the sacramental life, and that's been so challenging in this time of pandemic, is there's been that privation, that lack of sacramental grace. We feel lifted, right? And so this is what we celebrate in an extraordinary way today on the Feast of the Ascension. This is the culmination, this marks the culmination of the Paschal mystery of Christ. his incarnation, his life, his passion, his death, his resurrection, and it culminates with the ascension. Now, the time between the ascension and the parousia, the second coming of Christ, this is the time of the church. This is our time. This is where we're given the gift of the Spirit, where Christ says, I will be with you till the end of the age. And how is Christ with us? In his word, in his sacrament, his Eucharist, in his Spirit, and in each other. So Christ indeed keeps his promise. The time between the ascension and Pentecost and the parousia, the second coming, is the time where we are called to continue the work of Jesus Christ in the world, the saving mission of Christ. St. Teresa of Avila says, Christ has no hands but ours, no feet but ours, and I would say we are also called to be the heart of Christ, the healing presence of Christ in the world. And that's where restorative justice is so important. It is so close to the heart of Jesus. This movement of restoration, of healing, of responding to harm. This is really the nature of the church. This is who the church is called to be. Now, we hear in the readings today that the coming of the Spirit is predicted by Jesus. In a few days, the Spirit will come, the Paraclete, the Advocate, and it literally transforms them. They worshiped, but they doubted, we hear in the gospel. That doubt really flies away when the Spirit comes and convicts them. And they're given that message of truth, and they're given courage. We also hear Jesus say in that Great Commission, so this is what's interesting about the readings, we can tell that there's something afoot in terms of movement, of transition of time, because we hear from the very beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, and we hear from the very end of the Gospel of Matthew. And so something's happening, the inbreaking of God's kingdom in a new way, carried by the church. And so Jesus says, remember all that I have commanded you. Now, friends, we have struggled as a church in response to the scourge of clergy abuse, because when we did not treat victim survivors as we should have, seeing the presence, the wounded Christ in them, we did not live according to the Spirit. We did not remember what Christ had commanded us. And this is why we've struggled in that area. And restorative justice is both an instrument of naming the harm, but also a path forward to healing. So what is restorative justice? And how can it help heal a wounded church and world? It is a philosophical and practical approach to harm. It might be criminal harm. It might be non-criminal harm. It is an opportunity to respond to harm in a way that invites those who are direct victims or those who might be the victims of the ripple effects of harm, secondary effects of harm, to tell their story, to name how that harm has affected them. And I can tell you, having been in this work for about 4 years now, something very powerful and dynamic happens in restorative justice, either healing circles or restorative justice processes. Because people are invited to say, this is what happened. Other people are enlightened as to the nature of harm. It asks 3 fundamental questions, restorative justice. Who was harmed? What was the nature of the harm? And how can it be redressed or repaired? And it is victim-survivor centered, but it may include a perpetrator of harm only if the victim survivor is comfortable with that, and really only if the perpetrator is owning what they did in terms of accountability. Because great harm can be done if that doesn't happen. So who is there? Usually a representative of the community, the victim survivor, and sometimes the perpetrator, and a facilitator as well. And so 3 questions are asked, and what happens is, as a survivor tells their story, people come to a greater sense of accountability. When perpetrators are part of these restorative practices, they understand what happened, the consequences, the effects of that harm. Sometimes they enter into a friendship, or even sometimes reconciliation happens as well in some pretty extraordinary ways. You could have heard a pin drop at Our Lady of Lourdes when a man by the name of Frank, a victim survivor in his 70s, talked about how he was abused by a priest and how that abuse affected him. And for everybody who listened, and it brings back feelings just talking about it, it was just surreal. And it was very courageous of him to do. And people came up to me after and said, I had no idea. And he said what was even worse for victim survivors than the original harm of abuse is the fact that when they came forward, they were often not believed. Sometimes they were blamed. And that is, many of them will say that was even worse than the original abuse. Tom Johnson is the former county attorney of Hennepin County who just retired. There was a story in the Catholic Spirit about Tom retiring as the ombudsman for the diocese. Outreach to victim survivors is his role, and it's a very unique role in the country. His wife, who's also an attorney, and they're both friends of mine and members at Our Lady of Lourdes, she's now the ombudsperson. So she is continuing his work. He said something I will never forget. He said that movement of blaming and not believing and not tending to the harm of victim survivors is an inversion of the moral order. It literally turns the moral order on its head and what we should have done as a Catholic Church. Now, I'm going to get to the hope part as well, but we do have to name the harm, right? I'd say at Our Lady of Lourdes, we are not a dysfunctional family. We're going to talk about tough topics, and that's one of the things that restorative justice can do in a parish setting. When disputes happen, and I'm here to tell you, and I'm sure you could tell me as well, they do happen in a parish setting from time to time. Restorative practices in terms of healing circles are a good way of moving through that and coming to resolution. Another story about how restorative justice worked powerfully. I was in West Virginia with Janine Geske. So Janine Geske quickly is the pioneer in the world in terms of using restorative justice and restorative practices to heal the harm of clergy abuse. She was a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice, and she encountered restorative justice in a powerful way at a 3-day session at a prison. She wanted to learn more about it as a circuit court judge before she was on the court. It literally transformed her view. Like me, she was skeptical. We're trained lawyers, and we kind of think, well, that sounds fuzzy and new age and that sort of thing. But she saw that it worked, and she felt a call to leave the court at the height of her career, right, of Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice, and she's been doing restorative justice ever since. So when someone, hears about this or is harmed in Rome and they want to learn more about restorative justice, they go to folks there, and who do they send? They send them to Janine. And so I've had the privilege to learn from her and work with her. So she and I were in West Virginia with a couple of other colleagues. West Virginia is a diocese that has suffered great harm because of the malfeasance and the abuse and really the corruption of its former bishop. And he retired just days after he turned 75, and a lot of things came to light. You can certainly Google that. The Washington Post did an in-depth series of stories, and it's very sad. So they contacted us, and we went out there at the end of February, and they did a great job setting this up. But we saw, and Janine saw once again, the power of restorative justice to bring healing, because people were able to tell their story. Mothers were able to tell their story about how their kids had been harmed, including seminarians. And so they told that story, and one person said, "We finally have hope." Why? Because somebody's encountered them in their pain, accompanied them, and as they express it, healing begins. It's a beautiful thing, and it is close to the heart of Christ. Now, it's particularly effective in a Catholic setting because restorative justice is aligned with biblical justice and with Catholic teaching. So biblical justice, very quickly, you have 3 types of justice: retributive justice, which is punishment, retribution. You have distributive justice, which the prophets are concerned about, and that is the just distribution of the goods of the land. And then you have restorative justice, which is, I would say, the journey from liberation to the promised land for God's people, Israel. That is all about restoration. Christ's ministry is really combines all three, but really is primarily restorative. Now, one of the things that I didn't notice in the first 16 years of priesthood is how much the theme of restoration is all throughout Scripture. It's in the prayers of the liturgy, and it's also in the writings of the early church fathers. It's all about restoration. And so when I finally got into this work and my eyes were open, I thought, my goodness, it's everywhere. The preface of Easter, which you won't hear today because I have to do the preface for Ascension, but it talks about restoration. The reading today, the first reading, talked about the restoration of Israel. And so this is very close to who God is, restorative justice. It's used, restore or restoration, 130 times in Scripture. And it is also very close to the mission of Catholic social teaching, which is trying to be an instrument of the dignity of the human person and human flourishing, and also opposes unjust structures. Now, here's the challenging reality. And give me a few extra minutes today as I move through this, because it's hard to give a summary in just a really quick snippet. But here's the challenging reality in terms of how some church leaders, some bishops responded to those who were harmed by clergy abuse. We violated almost every one of our own principles of Catholic social teaching in how we responded to victim survivors. The dignity of the human person, solidarity, the preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable. In all of those ways, the common good of not only our community, but our society. The reason we were charged by Ramsey County as an archdiocese is we became deleterious to the public good in our lack of vigilance for children's protection. And so we violated our social teachings, and they provide a sharp rebuke, but on the side of hope, they provide a way back, a path forward, if we follow them and if we follow the teachings of Christ. So I want to name the harm, and then we'll end with what I think is a very hopeful story here in the Archdiocese. The Archdiocese has become the national leader in the integration of restorative practices and restorative justice. Now, there's other dioceses doing it as well, and we don't say it patting ourselves on the back. We went from really the pit of destruction to a movement upward, and there's a lot of dimensions to that. So first of all, to those who were abused by priests, their lives forever altered, as Frank told his story in his 70s, still feeling the effects. And yet he's turned that deep harm into a crusade for greater justice and accountability in the church. And I have a lot of regard for Frank. He and some other victim survivors work on our restorative justice working group. Now, what about the ripple effects? You folks who are here and you who are watching at home, you're all part of the secondary trauma and effects of the clergy abuse and the attendant cover-up. Maybe a neighbor says, well, why are you still Catholic? Maybe one of your children has left the church and said, I don't want anything to do with the church. I heard the other day there was a theologian at one of the Catholic universities in the country, and she was so deeply disturbed by how inconsistent the church's response was with Catholic theology. So those stories go on, and some have left the church. A number of folks have left. And God bless the folks who have stayed. God bless you for continuing to journey. And I don't blame those who have left. I hope they come back and make the church stronger and more just. But there are a lot of ripple effects. The loss of morale of good priests, your pastor, others, good priests who are doing good work. The loss of morale for average Catholics as well. The loss of credibility to proclaim the gospel of Christ, including the gospel of justice. People will say, well, why should we listen to the bishops on justice when they can't get it right in their own communion? And I would say when we want to assert our rights, like the rights of religious freedom, it's a heavier lift. So when the bishops of Minnesota come out and say these are our rights, and they were right about that, the law was definitely on the side of the church in this one, in my opinion. It's a heavier lift, though, when we've been deleterious to the public good. So all of those things are sources of harm. But only when we name the harm and let people express themselves will we move to greater accountability, when we appreciate that harm. Now, when they had the summit in Rome a year and a half ago, those who set up the summit, the Clergy Abuse Summit, said to the bishops who were attending, if you have not met with a victim survivor, meet with a victim survivor and hear their story before you come. Why? Well, that's a restorative practice, because you hear about the nature of the harm and it fosters greater accountability. The work isn't an abstraction, but rather rooted in experience, in the experience of harm. What has occurred in the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis is a source of really profound hope. For me, for others, for those who are victim survivors as well. It really has been a lot of work and a lot of pieces that needed to be put in place, and I start with Archbishop Hebda. He is a humble shepherd. So there's people will tell you that if there are 40 people in the room, Archbishop Bernard Hebda is probably the smartest guy in the room. What's more important to me is if there's 40 people in the room, Archbishop Hebda is probably the most humble person in the room. That's what I've seen. That's extraordinary. We have nothing to do with our intelligence or lack of intelligence, but as people of faith, we do have a lot to do in responding to grace in terms of leading a humble life. And so it starts at the top, it really does. And Archbishop Hebda has embraced restorative justice, he's met with victim survivors, and he's done an extraordinary job as a humble shepherd and a source of healing. Competent leaders in the chancery, victim survivors who are part of the solution, on the working group, on the clergy board that reviews cases, the clergy review board. They are in all those positions. And so we've moved to a more victim survivor-centered response. My colleague, Paula Kempfer, was hired 1 month before I started my job, and we worked together. She's the outreach coordinator for restorative justice and abuse prevention, and we co-chair this restorative justice working group. So we now have 2 people who are dedicated to that work. So really good work, and part of my role and Paula's is to offer programming to parishes throughout the Archdiocese. It might be an evening program like I did at Presentation in Maplewood in December. It might be a preaching weekend. Paula does a number of programming opportunities for parishes and victim survivors as well. This is my final 2 points very briefly. Restorative justice is so powerful and so potent in terms of potential in the church because this is fundamentally who we are. As Christian disciples, we are not fundamentally in any stretch those who harm. We're called to be people of Christ's light who heal and restore. Pope Francis has likened the church to a field hospital, right? It's a beautiful image, but it's a challenging image. This is who we are. There's the parable of the Good Samaritan. The challenge is that the church was both the robber who stole and beat from the victim and also the priest who walked by. But in the ancient church, the inn was supposed to be an image for the church. The inn where the man is cared for and brought back to life and healing. Now, one of the things that I'm excited about, in the midst of the challenge of this pandemic, there is a lot of harm. Now, why do you say, well, Father, you're excited? That seems a little morose. I'm excited about what we can do in the aftermath in terms of confronting injustice, systematic injustice, and helping people heal onto a renewed and more just humanity. The church can have a role in that if she gets her house in order, if she responds with greater accountability for those in leadership and those who have harmed, if she begins to heal and foster a victim-survivor-centered response. Pope Francis has said, what will it look like in the aftermath of the pandemic? And he said in very stirring words in Rome a couple weeks before Easter, he said, we're called to choose what matters and leave behind what matters less, to choose to be in relationship with God, to choose to be Christian disciples who can really be a source of light and healing in this time of pandemic and this post-pandemic world. But friends in Christ, this will only happen when the church discovers her true nature, that Christ is always in the center of the church, that the church is always and needs to be about healing, integrity, justice, and restoration. Restorative justice, while not a panacea, not a cure-all, and restorative practices provide a great opportunity to help the church live out her fundamental mission.